and we have Simon Crittle joining us on the channel. Simon, welcome to the channel and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
So a little story about how Simon is actually on the show. I think it was about 8 years ago, I picked up a book, which I actually have right here with me, called The Last Godfather, and it's written by Simon. And I read this book and I was absolutely just blown away by it. It's about Joe Massino, who was the boss of the Bonanno crime family. And it basically talks about his rise to power, and it covers a lot of interesting parts of kind of mafia history, some key events actually. So that's the reason that I got Simon on to the show. So Simon, just tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into writing? And obviously you're from Australia and now you're in the US. How did that all happen?
Yeah, no, happy to give you a very brief account. I guess it's not an everyday thing that an Australian finds themselves writing about the New York Mafia. But I found my way to New York. I was a reporter there, firstly for the New York Post and then later for Time magazine. And I just became fascinated that the stories that I'd heard about and movies that I'd seen when I was a kid, referred to what was, really still going on in New York City. There really were 5 crime families. And from time to time, you read about various mafiosi getting arrested and put on trial and things like that. And so I started to look into it. And by the time I reached Time magazine, I convinced my editors to let me do a story on Joe Massino, who was at the time had recently been indicted. This is in the early 2000s. And they were referring to him as the last Don or the last Godfather. The Last Don is actually a book written by Mario Puzo, so I couldn't use that for the cover of for the title of my book. So I called it The Last Godfather. And there is some crossover from the real Godfather. Supposedly, the real Godfather is based on Joe Bonanno, who was the founding father of the Bonanno family. So anyway, I got into it that way, and it was a big project that I spent a couple of years on, and I got very, very, immersed in it, and I got to know the FBI agents on the case very well, and I went to a lot of the scenes and the sites, if you like, in New York, where a lot of these things took place, murders, and where the actual bodies were buried. I saw them being dug up, and so it was a fascinating time.
So how did you actually pick up the story on Joe Massino? So you were working for the New York Times, is that right? And how did that story actually happen?
I was working for Time magazine.
Time magazine, right? Okay, got you.
Yeah, and I was the New York correspondent and for Time magazine, and so I had the luxury or the professional duty, if you like, to not only just read the big national publications, because Time is a national magazine. So instead of just reading the New York Times and the Washington Post and our competitors and so on, I would read all the New York tabloids as well, of which I loved and found fascinating. I mean, I worked for one of them, so I knew the streets of New York pretty well. And I had been and when I was working for the New York Post, had been in, just covered a few little mob trials from here to there. Nothing huge. I went and did some stuff on a prosecution of the New Jersey family, interestingly enough, which supposedly has crossover with the Sopranos. You'll constantly find this sort of like these links between Hollywood, if you like, and real life. Invariably, Hollywood is a lot more glamorous, but when you get into the real life stuff and you really dig into it, there is some amazing stories there. I mean, it's just incredible to me. And I think most people who are sort of fascinated by this sort of topic, that these sort of things really go on, that the mafia, for example, murder in the mafia is a part of their business. The rackets that they get involved in, which are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, are going on all the time. And so it's a fascinating subject. I was just drawn to it. And the tough thing for me working for a national magazine was to try and convince the editors that the mafia was still a story. It was, you know, since the 80s and so on, it had really been, a lot of the New York mafia had been sort of deconstructed or had been broken down, and a lot of the bosses had been put in jail. And so it wasn't really, you know, front page news anymore, especially since John Gotti had been put away, you know, and he really was the last big sort of like, I guess, you know, mafia figure that really captured the popular imagination. So to get them to sort of go back, and I did it by saying, look, here's the last guy still on the street. I mean, this is a great story. And the thing that was difficult for me was, of course, none of my editors or anybody had heard of this guy. But the reason for that was because he was so good at what he did.
Yeah.
The fact that you didn't know who he was really the basis of his power.
Sure.
He stayed under the radar for so long. I mean, literally since the 1960s until the early 2000s, he was out there doing his thing. So I just thought that this was a fantastic character, that I had to get, you know, involved in this. And of course, it's very difficult. I mean, you can't call up a mob figure and say, do you mind if I interview you? You have to do very, very deep investigative reporting, and it involves poring over hundreds of pages of court documents and things like that.
So, I mean, bear in mind that we're talking about the early 2000s. So obviously 9/11 has happened. So all the attention's kind of shifted away from mob, like traditional mob stories. And so I think the emphasis on the mob had gone away by that time. So you had a bit of a time convincing your editors to cover a mob story, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It was also because it's a New York story. You know, it's not necessarily a national story. Although it was interesting after I did the story was published in the magazine. It wasn't the cover, but it was a big story. It was 7 pages. A lot of other big publications around the country and even around the world sort of jumped on the story. It was the front page of, I think, the LA Times a few days later, and you know that was you know. Editors like to see that. You like to be followed by other people, and so I think they were sort of happy that they'd gone with the story and sort of legitimized it, and then just watched everybody kind of just follow us. And it, you know, and it spawned other things too. Obviously, it spawned my book, but also you know, the Bonannos had a strong connection with Canada, and we had with Time Magazine, for example, we had a Canadian edition. And we then ran stories in the Canadian edition, sort of with the Canadian connection, if you like, because all that came up too. The murder of the three captains, which I'm sure we'll go into a little later, was actually carried out by these Canadian Zips. You know, these Sicilians who were living in Canada, came down from Montreal, did the hit, and then went back. And so there's been books written in Canada about that and so on, but we were really the first to kind of cover that story in detail in the Canadian market. And you know, and so yeah, it was a terrific story, and people still, you know, contact me from time to time and want to talk about it.
So a guy like Joe Massino, I mean, where do you start? I mean, what was Joe Massino, for the viewers? What was Joe Massino's early life like? How did he grow up? He grew up in, from my memory, Queens. He was a Queens guy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he's very much a Queens guy. His base of operation was in an area of Queens called Mass Beth, and I describe it in the book. It's sort of it's almost like a town, if you like. I mean, Queens, you know, Queens is famously in New York sort of known for not being the most exciting borough in the city of the 5. You know, it's pretty suburban, but you know, at the same time there are some pretty gritty, poor neighborhoods in Queens. Mass Beth is sort of like its own little island, if you like. It's surrounded by big freeways, and it's also surrounded by these huge cemeteries. Back in, I think, the late 1800s, they stopped burying people on Manhattan because they were running out of room, and they moved all the cemeteries over into Queens and Brooklyn. And so this is sort of, I mean, back in the day, this would have been really rural, but these days it's obviously, it's part of the greater New York metropolis, but at the same time it's kind of cut off. And so I think for a guy like Massino, that's good. You know, it's a good base of operations. You know, you're sort of out of the way. You're not, if you're in Little Italy, if you're in Manhattan, there's a lot of people watching you. There's a lot of cops. you don't want that. The other thing too about Macbeth, at the bottom of Macbeth is it's sort of built on a gently sloping hillside. At the bottom of the hill, it's very much industrial, and there's a lot of warehouses, and there's canals and sort of rivers and things like that. And really, it's a place that trucks came in and out of New York, transporting freight. And this is sort of where they would often go, and they would drop off the trailer and they would get a new one, things like that. And so Massino worked in and around the sort of the industrial areas of Queens and Macbeth as a young man. And sort of in his early heyday, he became a truck hijacker. He first of all started off as sort of a disciple or an apprentice of Rusty Rastelli, who was the one of the former bosses back in the 60s and the 70s. Rastelli ran a network of so-called lunch trucks, or food trucks as you call them now. Those guys had what they would call routes, like a milkman would have a route or whatever. They could be fairly big operations. They could have dozens of these trucks. Massino, as a young man, drove one of these trucks. He was very much sort of a food guy. He was involved in preparing food, catering, restaurants, things like that. But obviously also part-time, or what we know now was a pretty formidable gangster even back in the early days. He was obviously a very capable guy, very bright, very careful, very treacherous, very dangerous, powerful, even as a young soldier, respected right throughout the city and known in mafia circles from the early days. There's evidence that he committed one of his first murders in the late 1960s. And so, that he started off basically, working rackets out of his lunch truck. He became what's known as a fence, where you receive stolen goods and distribute them. That's a very important part of the mafia. You want to have people not only who are stealing stuff, but who can get rid of it. And you want it all to stay within the family, supposedly. You don't want to be working with outsiders. You want people you can trust, people that you can hold power over, people that have fear, that are fearful of you, who will do what you want, and who will be very unlikely to, rat you out, talk to the cops, talk to the feds. And so, he started out that way. He was probably running numbers, the numbers racket out of his lunch truck. I would say that was a very common thing. Numbers is an illegal lottery, maybe taking illegal sports gambling bets, but certainly he was a fence working in those truck yards in the 1970s, and that's kind of where he got his start.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because in the mafia, gambling and loan sharking go quite nicely together, don't they? Because if you gamble and you lose a lot of money, you're going to need a loan shark to get more funds, and you'll probably end up gambling even more. So it's this killer cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they go hand in hand. I mean, illegal gambling is obviously well. Let me take a step back. Legal gambling on say sports, say the football, or even any other form of legal gambling, obviously is highly regulated, and it's only conducted in certain areas, like for example in Las Vegas and in other gambling towns and on Indian reservations and things like that. And so there is a big market, especially in a gritty, grimy place like New York, where you've got a lot of people who sort of are tangentially kind of connected to low-level criminals, things like that. People, what you might refer to as sort of street guys, people who are doing it tough and who aren't necessarily always making a living legitimately. Has been a very common thing in New York history and in any big city. It's just that in New York it was very, very well organized. So there is a market for illegal gambling. People who don't have the means or don't have the ability to travel to a casino or whatever, and just want to place a bet with their local gambling sort of connection, some guy who's connected, if you like, it's a very easy thing to do. And as you start to lose money, when you need more of it, because you want to pay off your debts and whatever, so then the same guy or his associate or whatever can lend you the money. So-called loan sharking, where they charge you these sort of exorbitant interest amounts. Yeah. The thing is about the mafia is what you got to remember is that it's a criminal enterprise, but also these people don't have any scruples. They're not trying to do you any favors. And so someone who has the means or maybe has property or has assets or has a nice car or whatever, they can become what's known as a mark in the mafia. And so they will actually be sought out by the guys who are taking the illegal bookmakers and the guys loan sharking, because they know that once they get their hooks in, this person's just going to be paying and paying and paying. So they look for that. They want that.
So he gets in tight with Rusty Rastelli, who is an important figure in the Bonanno family, and I think he was part of the panel that ruled the Bonanno family after the whole Banana Wars, when Joe Bonanno got run out of New York, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, the Bonannos have a turbulent history, like most of the mafia crime families, especially the ones in New York, because the New York families obviously were making big money. If you look at the other families, like the Genoveses, for example, in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they were a very powerful family. The Gambinos became a very powerful family, especially with John Gotti later in the 80s. The Bonannos had trouble. They were powerful back in the day when Joe Bonanno was a boss. I mean, we're talking right back in the Depression now, and in the sort of like the Prohibition era. To be honest with you, the history of sort of Rastelli's rise is quite murky, and I think part of the problem is that books were written by people like Joe Bonanno and his son, also called Joseph Bonanno.
Yeah.
And we know that a lot of what was written in those books is not true. Joe Bonanno, for example, claims, or Joseph Bonanno, the father, claims that he was kidnapped, for example, by the boss of the I think it was the Buffalo family.
Yeah.
Well, it's almost certain that's not the case, So a lot of that history in the sort of the 50s, 60s with the Bonannos is a bit cloudy. But what we know is that Rastelli was a captain in the family back in those days, and eventually after the Banana Wars emerged to the top. So took over and became the boss. The previous couple of bosses before him were not significant. He became along, was fairly significant. The thing about Rastelli, though, was that he spent a lot of his time as boss in jail, right? So he got involved in labor racketeering, which is a high-risk enterprise, high-paying, but also high risk. He went to jail on several different cases over the decades, and so we really didn't see a whole lot of him on the street. And because of that, the Bonannos were weakened. And that's when we saw the rise of Carmine Galante. Carmine Galante obviously was a powerful captain in the family. And when Rusty Rastelli was away in jail, essentially assumed control of the family and was had support from some of the other big bosses, people like the Genoveses, Vinny the Chin Gigante and so on, supported him. And so Massino, as I'm sure we'll talk about, essentially represented the other faction of the family, which was with Rastelli, and we eventually saw he famously gunned down while he was eating lunch at a restaurant in Brooklyn.
Yeah. So basically, Rastelli goes into prison, and so Galante comes in. Is Massino close to Galante, or are they completely different factions of the?
I think they were different factions. Galante's rise is a little bit obscure as well. He sort of suddenly came on the scene in the 1970s, I believe. He was a vicious, dangerous, kind of cowboy type gangster. He sort of didn't play by the old rules, if you like. And so he was really a different faction. I mean, I would suspect, I never saw any testimony, or I never spoke to anyone who told me about Massino's relationship with Galante, but I expect that they had a sort of a professional respect for each other, because they were both powerful people, and they were both very much feared, and they were very dangerous people, and dangerous to each other, but certainly from different sides of the families, different fractions of the family. The fact that one of them ended up killing the other is sort of no great surprise. I mean, it was, these were the two kind of up-and-coming lieutenants, if you like, and when you had that power vacuum in the middle, they were sort of destined, I think, for a collision course. One of them was not going to make it.
So basically, Galante has upset all the other mob bosses of the family. He's refused to share his profits from his heroin enterprise, and the other bosses of the commission aren't very happy with him. So tell us a little bit about what happened after that and how Massino was involved in that whole process, that transitioning process.
Yeah, I mean, what we knew at the time. It's interesting how these things come out over the years. I mean, the blanks in the stories, the missing pieces of the puzzle, if you like, sometimes take generations to come out, and we've only really learned the full truth about who was behind Galante's killing in the last sort of, 10 years, really, since Massino turned state's witness and became the highest ranking mob boss in New York history to ever become a rat. And in doing so, he had to come completely clean about everything that he was ever involved in. And so we now know that Massino was instrumental in the gunning down of Galante and that restaurant, and that basically he was working at the behest of Rusty Rastelli, who was in jail at the time, and it was him and a couple of the other prominent captains who were behind it. The story always was that Galante's bodyguards, famously Caesar Bonaventure, who was another sort of well-known figure in the Bonanno family at that time, and was also involved in heroin trafficking. The story always was that the bodyguards turned on Galante and killed him, but what we never knew was on whose orders. And so we now know it was him, and that sort of that power dynamic, if you like, played out time and time again over those decades, where we've now learned, for example, with the murder of the three captains, which was famously dramatized in the movie Donnie Brasco. We now know, for example, that Massino was also behind that, and so he was very much a powerful figure pulling the strings behind the scenes. He was really Rastelli's number one lieutenant on the street during those years, and as we know now, and as Massino waited for Rastelli to actually come out of jail and die of natural causes before he assumed the being the head of the family, the boss, which was really harkened back to the traditional ways of what they all did it, of how it was supposed to have been done. I mean, the boss, if you go back to the sort of Sicilian Italian mafia, the boss is almost like almost like royalty, incredibly respected. But in New York, where a lot of the old ways, the Italian ways, kind of were corroded over the years. Bosses were routinely being rubbed out. Of course, John Gotti famously killed his boss at the Sparks Steakhouse in the 1980s. And so, and that's what people said to me about Massino. When people would say to me, what I would say to people, what was he like? I talked to agents and so on. I even talked to Joe Pistone, the famous undercover agent, and they said, they'd say a few things. They'd say, number one, he was very powerful, very much the real deal. He was a formidable gangster on the streets, one of the most powerful in the United States at that time, if not the most. The other thing they'd say is he was very dangerous, treacherous. People were greatly feared him. And I think my personal view is that true power of mob bosses comes from the amount of fear they instill in others. Because when people fear them, they'll do things for them. And the other thing they'd say is that Massino was sort of like this, very much sort of had these old world sort of values, in that he believed very strongly in sort of the integrity of the family and not ratting the family out, and he engaged in all the old traditions. For example, when they would make when someone was made, they would actually have a ceremony with a knife and a gun. He did all that. But my view is, though, that he did those things not necessarily out of some sort of quaint tradition, maybe quaint's the wrong word, but more so as a sort of a survival tactic, because there was some sort of genius in a lot of those things. I mean, the concept of omerta, for example, silence, is not just there because, it's not that we shouldn't just talk about each other. It's there because we don't talk about each other, because when we talk about each other, word gets around and the integrity of the criminal enterprise is compromised. And you certainly don't talk to law enforcement. And so he did all of those things. But as I say, I think it was out of The FBI agents would say paranoia. I believed it was just out of a sort of a self-preservation technique that he had used his whole life. And he right the way through his career. And he was incredibly careful and incredibly cautious. And right up until the time he was arrested, he was really unknown to the broader public.
So, I mean, going back to the actual murder of Galante, who was, in terms of the commission, who do you think was the driving force behind that? Because there's some surveillance pictures after the hit, pretty much immediately after the hit, where I think it is Bruno Indelicato. He's actually in Manhattan in front of the social club on Mulberry Street, the Ravenite, and he's high-fiving or hugging Agnello Della Croce. So that kind of gives an impression that the Gambino family were behind the strings on that.
To be honest with you, I don't exactly know the answer to that question, but that would not surprise me. I think the Bonannos and the Gambinos were quite closely aligned, and really the Genovese family was kind of on the other side of things. There's a few reasons for the alignment. As far as Massino goes, he was closely aligned with the Gambinos because John Gotti also lived in Queens. And in fact, they both Massino and Gotti only lived a few blocks away from each other. They were friends.
Yeah.
John Gotti famously used to put on illegal fireworks displays in the streets of Macbeth. Massino would have been there. I mean, they would have gone to each other's houses. Their children would have swum in each other's swimming pools and things like that. And so there was that close relationship between Massino and Gotti that goes right the way back to the early 70s. When they were both hijackers and were conducting rackets in that sort of part of town. But there were also other relationships. I think really what this comes down to is it's based on relationships between powerful figures. Obviously they were, and I no doubt there were others. I mean, I know, for example, that Massino did not have a good relationship with Vinny the Chin Gigante. And after, I think it was the murder of the three captains, he actually went to Gigante and said, went to his social club in Manhattan and said he needed to see him, and Galante came out and said to him, take a seat, and Massino looked at him and said, I'm not sitting, and he said, I just want you to know I'm the power now, and basically sort of said, don't mess with me, and so that just sort of shows you just how powerful he really was. And so I think with the murder of Galante, there definitely probably was some other family support. I'm not exactly sure who was pulling the strings out behind that one.
Yeah. Okay. So after that murder happens, which is an iconic murder, I mean, the picture
One of the greatest. I'd say it's probably the top three
definitely
well-known murders. And what you've got to remember is it's not the only murders that happened in the mob, but it was very spectacular. It happened very publicly, and it happened to someone who was known, not only within the mafia circles and the law enforcement, but it was already known in the kind of the greater sort of mob lore, if you like, LORE, and would have been known to people who read the tabloid newspapers and so on, because Galante was out there. He made no bones about the fact that he was, a force to be reckoned with. And so he was known on the street by a lot of people.
And he just looked like a gangster. I mean, the smoking of the cigar. And he actually, when he was gunned down, the image of him on the floor with the cigar still in his mouth is kind of like from the movies or something,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And he was meant to be a real nasty piece of work. I read stories about him that appeared in some of the New York papers before the murder. There was one in the New York Times I remember reading. Well, he was just a nasty, nasty man. It had no endearing qualities at all. I mean, personally, the way he was with other people, he was very abrasive, and really sort of threw his weight around. He was cocky and he was nasty. And so but also with his, you know, I think he just offended a lot of people. He by the time he was dead, he had a lot of enemies.
So when this hit happened, I mean, Donnie Brasco was on the scene at that kind of time period. Was there any interaction between Massino and Donnie Brasco? Did they, did they know each other? Did they work with each
They
other?
did.
Or?
They did know each other. They did know each other, not well, but they do certainly knew of each other. I mean, Donnie Brasco is obviously the undercover fake name for the very famous FBI agent Joe Pistone, who spent about 5 years as an undercover agent within the Bonanno Mafia family. Joe Pistone was not in Joey Massino's crew. He was in Sonny Black's crew. And the interesting thing is Sonny Black actually operated in Brooklyn, but not that far across the border of Brooklyn from Massino. So they actually were quite close to each other. And in the same way that Massino was very close to John Gotti and John Gotti's crew, who was also close by in Queens, Massino's crew and Massino was personally close to Sonny Black's people. And so they were involved in, in crime together. I mean, they bought and sold stolen goods from each other. They were truck hijackers together. They were involved in murders together. The way that sometimes these murders would be put together is different crews would do different jobs. And we know, for example, that Sonny Black's crew and Massino's crew and also Gotti's crew were all involved in the murder of the three captains. So they were well known to each other, and they would have known each other's. These are captains of these crews, right? Who would have had a number of soldiers. These are made guys underneath them, and each soldier would have had their own network of what they call guys who are connected. They're not made mafiosis, but they are criminals and they are involved with the mafia, and they're also, very importantly, they're protected. So if I'm connected to a mafia soldier, I pretty much have a free reign, almost like a green light, if you like. If someone messes with me, that person better know that I've got a whole big mafia family behind me that's going to come after them. And so that's why they had this power. And so at that time, Joe Pistone was an associate, one of these people, connected through Lefty Guns Ruggiero, who was a soldier and who was in Sonny Black's crew, and they knew each other. And the sort of the famous anecdote, if you like, of them actually speaking to each other happened in court after Massino got indicted on one of his many crimes and was brought in, and Joe Pistone was a witness in the case, of which he was in many cases. He claims that he helped put away about 200 different mobsters. And anyway, Joey Massino was walking past Joe Pistone in the courtroom, and Massino, who had a big personality, funny, cheeky sort of a guy, obviously, and a very big guy as well. I mean, at his height, he was, or at his maybe I should say at his greatest width, he was about 400 pounds. Which, due to the conversion into kilograms, is a very large amount. I mean, he was morbidly obese. He loved food, as I said before. He was a food guy, but he walked past Pistone, and Massino yells out. He says, "Hey, Donnie, who's going to play me in the movie?" And Pistone, fires back, "Sorry, Joey, we're having trouble finding an actor fat enough."
Oh, really? Wow.
And apparently, Massino thought that was quite funny and laughed. But Joe Pistone told me that himself. And so, they definitely knew of each other. But I think, Donnie Brasco, Joe Pistone knew people in Sonny Black's crew a lot better. And famously, Lefty Guns Ruggiero was killed because of, sorry, not Lefty Guns. That's a mistake. That's what happens in the movie. In real life, what happened was Sonny Black is murdered because of the Joe Pistone infiltration. The really significant thing about the Joe Pistone infiltration, and it does connect to Massino, is the Bonannos at that time, this is in the late 70s, early 80s, were so humiliated when that came to light. And the Joe Pistone story was such a sensation, not just within mob and FBI circles, but it became a big story right across the country. They were so humiliated that they were actually kicked off the Mafia Commission. Yeah. And it wasn't until years later, when Massino himself gets out of jail in the late 1980s, early 90s, that he manages to have the Bonannos reinstated and put back on the Mafia Commission. The other significant thing about that too is that in that hiatus period, those dark days when the Bonannos were, really considered to be a spent force, was the FBI downscaled their efforts to monitor the Bonannos. I mean, traditionally there was an FBI squad for each of the 5 families, and the Bonannos were joined up with one of the other squads. And so the FBI sort of took their eye off the Bonannos. And I mean, I had agents say to me quite openly that that was a big mistake, that they should have kept an independent squad totally devoted to the Bonannos. I mean, one FBI agent said to me, what they learned through that mistake was when you've got your opponents, and that's how they saw them. They saw them as their adversaries, their opponents, the enemy. When you've got them down, you're supposed to go out and annihilate them. What you don't want to do is sort of let them quietly regroup, which is exactly what the Bonannos did.
So that was the Donnie Brasco kind of era. If we roll back a little bit, but this is kind of still in that 70s, mid-70s era, there's the infamous event of the 3 Capos murder. Now, this is unprecedented in the mob. I can't think of any story or any incident where 3 high-ranking mob captains were gunned down in one fell swoop. So could you tell us?
Certainly not in modern mob history. I mean, things like that I think probably happened way back in the day.
Maybe, yeah, for sure, yeah.
Lucky Luciano and Al Capone and those sorts of characters. Yeah. But if you want to call, say, the 70s onward, say the modern period of the mafia, if you like, no, there's never anything like it. I mean, these captains are very, very powerful people. They have, networks of hundreds of criminals underneath them. And so to get 3 of them in a room and kill them is really extraordinary.
What led up to that whole thing? Why did, I guess it was Rusty Rastelli that would have sanctioned something like that? What were the factors behind that whole thing?
I mean, again, power, money, influence, and really control of the family. Massino again represented the sort of this traditional loyal faction to Rusty Rastelli, along with Sonny Black and others. And Sonny Red and the other 2 captains, Phil Lucky Giaccone and Big Trin, were represented another powerful faction within the family. And so, as Massino rose slowly through the ranks into power, and while he stayed loyal to Rusty Rastelli, and to assert his power and to essentially slowly take over the family, he had to kill off his rivals, and that's who they were. But we're not talking small potatoes here. These are very, very serious people, and so they were supported, again, as I say, by the Genoveses, for example, who were an extraordinarily powerful family in Manhattan. And so, to go against the wishes of mafia bosses over in Manhattan is a very brazen thing to do. And it's the sort of thing that gets you killed very quickly, unless you have your own army behind you, a significant force. And it just goes to show just how powerful Massino was, that he was able to not only orchestrate that hit, but to survive it afterwards, and to get the grudging respect of the bosses on the other side of the river, who knew that this is not someone to be messed with.
Sure. I mean, even in terms of an action that you're going to do within your own family, like whack 3 captains, you would still need sign off from the commission, right? I mean, you can't just kill 3 captains without getting permission from the other families, because I think in instances where that kind of does happen, there is some retribution there.
This thing though, that you have to have sort of unanimous support from the commission, though, is not necessarily the case. I mean, the commission doesn't always agree on everything, and on something like this is a good example. I mean, my understanding is that Vinny Gigante did not support choice, but to go along with it. And so it wasn't like he sort of was green lighted, go out, do it. He got some support from some very senior people in New York. He did it, and the others just had to fall in line once it's done.
So he got rid of the three captains, and basically now he's kind of the boss. He's pretty much the boss. Rastelli's he's aging, and so what happens then? I mean, I do recall he goes to prison around that point, or a couple of years after that, maybe.
Yeah, and so largely due to the Donnie Brasco infiltration, and because Brasco was on the inside during the time of the murder of the three captains, and because Sonny Black was also involved in the murders, essentially the FBI knew about the murder of the three captains within hours of it happening, right? Even though it was a highly orchestrated, extremely under the radar, carefully planned operation, there was an FBI agent there who knew what was going on, or at least knew some of it. And so, it didn't take long. I think I say in the book, that within, I think of a short time span, only a matter of days or weeks, the indictments just started to land, and everyone just started to get arrested who was involved in that hit. And so what happens is that, there are all these cases coming down because of the Donnie Brasco infiltration. Massino was one of many mobsters caught up in a whole range of different crimes and rackets and so on. The murder of the three captains was just one of them, but significant. And what Massino does is he takes off. He goes on the lam. And the reason we know that, the reason for that wasn't because he knew it wasn't going to catch up with him one day. He was advised, probably by his lawyers, that he had a better chance of beating the rap if he faced the case on his own, rather than be one defendant of many. Because the traditional sort of way of thinking about legal cases is if you say you've got 3 or 4 defendants and they prove pretty much definitively against one, the chance of the others going down sort of through association is much greater. Whereas
right.
if you're on your own, it's easier for your lawyer to sort of beat back the charges one by one and actually get you off. And amazingly, so that's what happened. So Massino goes on the lam. We know now that he went to, and the FBI obviously knew he was gone, and there was rumors about where he was, that he went to the Poconos, which is a sort of a mountainous area in Pennsylvania. And he hung out there for some years. He spent time living in a sort of a cabin that I actually went and saw, owned by Goldie Leisenheimer's family. Goldie was one of Massino's sort of lieutenants. And he stayed in various hotels and resorts and things up there. And so that's what happened. But eventually he comes back to New York and does face his day in court. But interestingly, he doesn't go down for the murder of the three captains. He goes down for a separate case altogether, which was a labor racketeering case, which was sort of unexpected. And so he goes to jail in the 1980s and spends some time there, as still running the family very much, or even though Rastelli's still alive, but he does his time in prison.
I mean, what's interesting is that we hear a lot about these mob figures and their street life, but I don't hear that much about their prison life. I guess it's a difficult one to cover. I mean, there's not much information out there. It's all hearsay. But
no, I don't think it's nearly as glamorous.
Yeah, I mean, what was Messina? I mean, how much do we know about Messina's life behind bars? obviously there was quite a lot of mob figures behind bars at that point. So did he have to? I mean, I'm assuming that he didn't have to get any protection or anything like that. No one was going to mess with him.
I don't think so. I mean, he went to federal prison, and New York State has federal prisons up in what they call upstate New York, and I think he was up there for some time. Um, uh, you know, I, there's not a whole lot known. I don't think there's much to know. What we do know is that he kept in touch with his his colleagues, if you like, in the mob, the other captains. He probably was still in a lot of ways pulling some of the strings. I mean, we do know for a fact that a lot of the mob bosses, even I believe Carmine Persico, who's been in jail for decades and decades, was still trying to run his family from his prison cell. And so, you know, we don't know a lot about, his life, but I mean, I don't think it would have been all that different from many other inmates. It would have been very dull and monotonous, and he had to do his time and get out.
So, I mean, during this time, he's built a very close relationship with his brother-in-law, Sal Vital.
So Salvador Vitali, or
Yeah.
better known as Good Looking Sal.
Yes, that's right.
He sort of had, he was, I don't know if I would describe him as good looking, but he sort of had sharp facial features, and he was very well dressed. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we haven't touched on in the interview so far is sort of Massino's personal life. He was married as a young age. He had 3 daughters, and he married a woman by the name of Josephine, and Josephine's brother is Sal Vitale. And so Sal is sort of Massino's probably closest associate right through his entire career. For example, Massino's social club, where he hung out with his crew in that Maspeth area that I described. I actually went and saw it. It's very close to the sort of the industrial areas and the truck the places where the trucks come in to change out their loads and so on. It was called J and S Cake.
Right.
J for Joseph and S for Salvatore. And so they were incredibly close. And of course, Massino marries Sal's sister. And so they were close their whole lives. The great irony, I guess we'll get to it, is in the end, it was Sal who was the number one witness against Joe at his trial. But the interesting thing is that I looked at this very closely and spent some years looking at this. From what I could see, from what I read in the court testimony, and from what I read about what people said about Joe and Sal and their relationship, is that there was a lot of jealousy there, always. Sal always played second fiddle to Joe. Joe was the one giving the orders. Sal was the one executing them, and literally executing them. I mean, Joe would say, "I need this person killed," and Sal would be the one who would be tasked to go out and organize the murder. And so I think he was resentful, especially later on, that he sort of never really came out of the shadow. And so when Massino was in jail, Sal was the acting boss because he was the underboss. He became the acting boss, and by the time Massino got out of jail, Massino and Sal's relationship was very strained, and Massino did not like the way that Sal had been running the family. He did not like the way that Sal had been treating other people. Sal was sanctioning murders, was really trying to consolidate his own power, was trying to get rich. He was greedy, and I described him in the book as a Don in gold chains, because he sort of, I think he was very enamored by the fact that he was, suddenly the big boss or the acting boss. And so he wore suits and jewelry and would strut around Queens and would be photographed by the FBI, very well dressed, while everyone else was sort of these low-life guys wearing velour tracksuits.
So you're doing the John Gotti, essentially.
Yeah, he was. And so, and so by the time Massino got out of jail, he was sort of done with Sal. And Sal was very quickly, although Sal was kept as the figurehead, as the underboss, he was sort of all his power was taken off him almost immediately. Sal drew attention to the family, and that would just went against everything that Massino believed in.
Exactly. I mean, Massino was very. I mean, when it came to surveillance, he was super careful. I mean, he would only have a select few in his inner circle, and kind of
That's
give
right.
orders through them. And he wouldn't really use phones, right? He would rely on messages.
No, and remember they of course mobile phones weren't really around. I mean, I guess they came out in the early 90s, but they were starting to be used, but no, certainly not. They never used them. I mean, they had all kinds of very kind of sophisticated ways to communicate that were under the radar. I mean, the famous one is they would go for these things called walk talks, where they would never actually talk inside, an actual building like a social club or wherever they'd hang out, because they knew that they were targets for electronic surveillance, and so they would walk around the neighborhood and. Famously that, you'd have the two people talking. So it might be Sal. Massino wouldn't do the walk talk, but he'd send Sal out to do them. So Sal would be walking along with someone else. They would talk, and there'd always be a guy a few paces behind, making sure that no one was coming up and listening. So yeah, I think that's sort of the, if you're sort of charting the sort of the rise and fall of Joey Massino, this is sort of the next chapter is Massino gets out of jail, demotes Sal, takes over the family, consolidates power, puts the Bonannos back in business, gets them back onto the commission. And you're absolutely right. I think what really stands out in my mind was just the extraordinary lengths that he went to sort of insulate the family from any further kind of law enforcement risk. And, I think Massino said it. He said it, many times. He didn't like being in jail. He did not want to go to jail. He saw what happened to Rastelli, who was his sort of his mentor. Rastelli spent most of his life in jail. Massino did not want that. So he went to extraordinary lengths in terms of counter surveillance. And so, there was a bunch of things that he did. So, the first thing he did when he got out was he shut down all the social clubs. So there was no longer any meeting or hanging out inside premises. He didn't want that at all. He refused to let any of his men, actually anyone in the family, was not supposed to ever even speak his name. This was sort of a touch of theatre that he borrowed from Vinny the Chin Gigante. Gigante used to go like this, or he'd have his men go like that instead of saying his name. Massino, if you and I were talking and it would come up, you'd say, I'm going to go and see, instead of saying Joey or the boss or the chief, as he was often known, you go, I'm going to go and see, and you go like that, without actually saying anything, so that his name would never be picked up on a wire. And the reason they did that was someone might be listening. So that was like an indication. So he was sometimes known as the ear, but that was a misinterpretation. They went like that to indicate someone might be listening, because they always were conscious that anyone around them could at any time be wearing a wire, or that there could be electronic bugs around them. So there was that. The other thing that he did too was he stopped the crews of the different captains from sort of associating from each other. So he walled them off, sort of compartmentalized them in a way. So they all did their own crimes independently. He didn't want them mixing, because the fewer people who know what's going on, the better. Really what you want in a crime family is only the boss, the underboss, and the very senior ranking people knowing sort of the whole story. You want your lieutenants only knowing what you want them to know and not knowing what your other lieutenants are doing. So when it comes down to it, if you're all standing in court together one day, you can't rat each other out because you don't know what the other guys have done.
Yeah.
And so, he just went to these extraordinary lengths. I mean, and he was also very, very good just with counter surveillance personally. He would often tell his lieutenants, watch your mirrors. So when they were driving around in their cars, you're supposed to constantly looking in your rear view mirrors and your side mirrors to see if you're being followed. All sorts of things like that. The lengths they would go to avoid any kind of surveillance was just extraordinary, because they knew that they were constantly being watched by the FBI, constantly.
I'm surprised that they didn't have the sign of, rubbing one's belly when referring to Massino.
Yeah, I don't think he would have liked that.
No,
I think that's the
no.
sort of thing that would have got you in trouble pretty quickly. They were very careful not to offend him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You didn't want to piss this guy off.
Oh, of
I
course.
remember there was a story once when I think it was Sal and Goldie noticed outside Janus Cake. This is in Maspeth, that on one of the distant buildings something appeared. They could see it. It was that had been put there, and they climbed up on these rooftops to see what it was, and it was a camera that had been sort of built into like a box, like think of a sort of a stereo box, if you like, and it had a glass cutout, a glass sort of little window in it, and inside was a camera which was recording all these guys, the comings and goings from the social club. And I think Goldie said to Sal, "Oh, we should," jokingly said, "Oh, we should rip it off and throw it down on the ground, so it would smash." And Sal said, "No, no, no, I don't think the chief would like that." They were always thinking like what Massino would say, and it was better for them to really to allow the FBI to think that whatever that camera was recording was getting the real stuff. And
Yeah.
they probably would have gone to the lengths of having guys coming and going and being purposely filmed by the camera
Yeah.
as a decoy to
Yeah.
what was really going on the next street, And so there was just this constant game of cat and mouse, and Massino was extremely good at it. This was the thing that was said to me by some of the senior agents who were investigating him at this time. I remember one of them saying to me, Jack Stubing, he said he realized he went and saw Massino. Sometimes they would just turn up and say how's it going and whatever. And Stubing said he went and knocked on the door of one of Massino's restaurants. He came out and they sort of bantered, and it was sort of this kind of coded conversation where the FBI agent saying, are you still involved? And of course the Massino saying, no, absolutely not. I've turned a new leaf, whatever. And Stubing says to him in the end something like, I guess I'm just wasting my time then, aren't I, Joe? And apparently Joe looked him right in the eye and said, "You're not wasting your time." To let him know that, of course, I'm still a mobster, but guess what? I'm too good, and you're never going to ever get me, and you're never going to figure out
Right.
how. And Stubing said to me after he said he went away from that meeting, and he said in the conversation, it was extraordinary. He said, "Oh, Massino was joking about the different surveillance cars that were coming by, even knew the number plates of the actual digits on the number plates. Say, oh, there was that red car that had numbers this, that, and the other. I saw that was here the other day, and whatever." And Stubing went away, and he said he was absolutely astonished at the level of detail that Massino knew about the FBI operations and how they were being and how they were watching him. And he said at that moment he realized that all the traditional tools that the FBI had in their toolbox, whether it be informants, surveillance, those sorts of things, was never going to work with Massino. He was just too good. He was too careful. They were never going to get close enough to him to record him. They were never going to get anyone, a confidential informant or an agent anywhere near him and close enough to get any information or to be able to record him. And so they realized then that to get this guy, they were going to have to completely sort of rewrite the rule book of how you go after someone. And then that's the sort of the second half of my book. How they did that was pretty amazing, and it took them years, but they eventually did it.
And they never got him on a wiretap. Same as I think Vinny the Chin. I don't think they ever got him on a wiretap either. It's amazing.
No, I don't believe they ever did. I never saw any recordings of him. What we do know though is we do know snippets of what Massino would say to people, but only because those people turn rat or turn witness and would recount conversations and say, then he said to me this and that, and then I went out of the room and this happened. So it's really only just reconstructions. We don't have any, not like John Gotti, who was famously recorded at the Ravenite Social Club and others. No, we don't. The closest they got to him, well, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but when they did wire people up and they did finally sort of close in on Massino, the way they did it was that they recorded lower level people talking about things that higher ups were involved in, and they just slowly moved up, arresting people as they went and getting them to flip until they finally got to Sal, and he flipped. And then they had enough of these people in the end that the evidence that was being corroborated by all these people was just overwhelming. But really, the way it started, the investigation of Massino was a forensic accounting investigation, and the thing that it wasn't a wiretap, it was a paper trail, and they managed to connect Massino to a nobody low-level businessman who owned parking garages in Manhattan, which is obviously a big cash business, which the mafia likes.
Right.
And they found, after they subpoenaed, that guy I spoke about, Jack Stubing, who realized Massino was just too good. He said, okay, we've got to change our tactics. And so they started to subpoena financial documents from Massino's accountant and other people. Of course, Massino's lawyers tried everything to block it, but they got some documents of which the FBI had no idea what they were looking at, because it was all financial documents. They got these young, very young agents who had accounting degrees to start going through it with a fine-tooth comb. They literally set up these extraordinary sort of spreadsheets and spent literally years assembling this sort of web of financial information. And in those boxes of documents, they found three checks. Three checks had been written. And they'd been written by this guy to Massino personally, by the name of Barry Weinberg. This is the owner of these parking garages. And as the agent said to me, the first question they said to themselves is, who's Barry Weinberg? Who is this person? And so they did a full-blown investigation of this guy, found out that he was a businessman, associated with various mafia figures in Manhattan, owned parking garages, and was in business with the mob. He was the front guy, if you like, the legitimate businessman, but really the people who were making all the money in the background were Massino and some others. And so, they famously dug enough information on Barry in the end that they had enough to charge and indict him. And so they followed him for some weeks and sort of established his pattern where he would go in different days. And on one of these days, when they knew that he wouldn't be around any of his mob people, they followed him in a couple of unmarked cars. This is the FBI and also I think some of the local police. And they stopped him, I believe it was in New Jersey. And they said, excuse me, sir, would you please come with us? And they got him out of his car and into the back of the van where the FBI agents are. The FBI agents laid it out and said, right, we've got you on this, we've got you on this, you've got you on this, and we've got you on this. You're going to go to jail for a long time. You're never going to be free again. Or you can turn witness for the prosecution right now. We'll give you 15 minutes to decide. And apparently it only took him about 3 seconds. He said, I'll do it. And they literally wired him up that day and pushed him out onto the street and had him making tape recordings for, I believe, some years.
Wow. I mean, that is the rule, isn't it? When they bring someone in, you try to turn them as quickly as possible before any suspicion.
That's right. You want to turn them straight away. You don't want to give them any time to think. I mean, the other thing too, the more time they have to think, the less likely they might be to do it. The other thing too is they might try and run, take off. But more dangerous is if somehow they are compromised, if somehow the mafia finds out that this person has been under investigation, has been pulled aside by the feds and has been offered some sort of deal like this, suddenly that person becomes extreme risk to the enterprise, to the operation, and their life is in great danger. Yeah. And so, in those moments, you want to basically, if you say to that guy, okay, forget it, go on your way. I mean, he's in great danger. If he becomes a witness for you, obviously you're watching him all the time and so on, and you can do your best to protect him. I mean, still is great risk, but you want to turn them straight away. And, once, I mean, it's sort of, you almost felt sorry for the guy. I mean, his life was over in that moment. And he became, a rat then and there. He was going to turn on all the people that he was friends with and supposedly loved. Apparently, he liked hanging around with tough guys. He was very enamored by the mob figures that he spent time with, and that was really it for him. And he died not many years later. Really, just this tool, if you like, used by the FBI to get to Massino, and they really just owned him. I mean, his life was, from that moment on, his life was not his own. He did what he was told, making tapes every single day.
And then they basically got to Sal Vitale, who was basically Massino's right-hand man. And then it was just a game changer, right?
Well, it sort of started like almost like a dominoes falling over. Barry was close to a mob figure by the name of I think his name on the street was Shellackhead Cantarella. Cantarella. I think he was from Staten Island, and it was that he was a captain, and Massino was close to him. Cantarella was an earner. It was, mob figures do this, one, because they like it, but two, because they want to make money. And so a guy like Massino is going to surround himself often with people who are making a lot of money, because the more money they make, the more he gets of it. And so Barry Weinberg was close to a mob figure by the name of Cantarella. Cantarella was close to Massino. Through the information that the FBI got from Barry Weinberg, they managed to get Cantarella and indict him, and they just slowly started indicting. And as they turned each one, he would then give evidence against the next one. And so I think within, only a few months of some of these people getting arrested and being taken off the street, put in jail, by this stage, they're not being used as confidential informants. There's just too much going on, if you like. It starts to sort of become obvious that you've been compromised, that there are senior figures being arrested who are probably talking, who are being kept in protection in some sort of secure facility. And so, of course, Massino by now, and everybody else in the Bonanno family, and probably right throughout the mob in America, is knowing that, the FBI is really on a tear here, and it's only a matter of time. And so eventually, yes, they turn a number of senior figures within Massino's sort of orbit, some of them who were quite close to him, and finally it was Sal. And Sal was the one who betrayed him in the end, and much in the same way that Sammy the Bull Gravano turned on John Gotti, so Sal did to his boss. He was the underboss, same as Sammy the Bull was, and so he turns on Massino. And so by now you've got about 7 senior mob figures who have all given evidence, depositions and other things against Massino. And so Massino knew it was coming down.
What was Massino's reaction? Was he shocked, or did he have an inkling that this was kind of going to happen?
I mean, I think in the last few months he probably knew it was going to happen because of what I just described, because of the fact that all of his close associates were suddenly being pulled off the street, and were being put into hiding. The enterprise was disintegrating. There was no doubt about it. He would have known that. And the FBI agents who were on the case told me that when they're getting ready to make an arrest, what they want to do is they want to keep an eye on someone for a while. You don't just turn up to their house and hope that they're there. You do what they call, you have them in pocket, so you know where this person is, and that would involve tracking them down somewhere, and then keeping an eye on them for a few days. And they did that, and I think by then it was pretty obvious to everyone what was happening. There was cars on the street. Massino would have known that they were there, and in fact did. And when they finally did go and knock on the door, they apparently walked into this, beautiful faux Georgian marble, all white, beautiful white interior marble, and so on. sorry, I said a faux Georgian mansion, and it was all white marble inside and very beautiful. Swimming pool in the back, you know, a lot of luxury cars in the driveway. There he was, apparently in a black velour tracksuit. Massino famously was sort of dressed down. I think someone said to me that they never ever saw him wearing a tie. He didn't wear a suit. He was a street guy. He was a suburban, you know, tough guy. And they came there. He was in his, you know, it was the morning, and the agents had been sitting out, and I believe he said to them, "Oh, I thought you were going to come in yesterday. I was expecting that," because he'd seen them out there. So they finally come in and they arrest him and they take him away. Apparently Josephine was there and sort of shocked. That's his wife. And they put him in the car. And I remember the agent said to me, as they, you know, were arresting him, they start taking down information, you know, on a sheet of paper. They call it biographical information. They start taking down your name, your social security number, and your address, and so on. So they're asking him questions. And apparently he was joking with the agents and saying, "Oh, I know who you are. You're so and so, and you're so and so." And he knew them all and their names and where they lived and all this sort of stuff.
Is
And I
that
think,
like a veiled threat in a way? Do you think he was?
I think so. I think so. I mean, Messina believed that whilst these people were watching him and wanted to know everything about him, he wanted to know who they were and as much as he could about them.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, because you're looking for a way to try and, you know, thwart the investigation. And so if you can do it because maybe someone's got a gambling problem or whatever, then great. I think by this stage, though, you know, the writing was on the wall. Massino knew that he was going to jail. He was going to face prosecution, and there was a good chance that he was never going to come out of, you know, out of custody again. But I think it was so in this discussion, it was almost a jovial thing. And he says to the female agent who's there, he starts making comments about her personally and who she is and so on. And she turned to him and said, "Oh, you know a lot about me." And he goes, "Well, you know, you know about me and I know about you." But as I say, I think by then it was sort of a joke, but yes, there's no doubt about it. I mean, he was conducting research on these people who were following him around. He knew who they were. You know, we later learned during the prosecution, you know, not very long later, during the court case, that the prosecutor, Greg Andres, who was only very young at that point, I think he was in his late 20s, you know, that there was, it came out that that some of the mob figures had talked about trying to have him assassinated. And these are the people that these agents that I just was talking about are working hand in hand with the assistant US attorneys who go into the court, prosecute the case. You know, they actually were planning to kill this guy, and
Kill
you know, which is
Massino.
unheard of. Massino wasn't, but some of the other people who were left on the street. So think about it. A lot of the big guys, the instrumental figures go inside, but there's still some left on the outside who were still trying to run the family. And they talked about trying to have this prosecutor killed.
Right, the prosecutor.
So I mean, you know, they're certainly not completely safe. I mean, it is a dangerous profession to get into, investigating mafia figures, no doubt about it. They don't want to go to jail. And if they have to kill, they will. Will they kill law enforcement in the United States? Very, very unusual. It has happened. In a place like Italy, it does happen. I mean, prosecutors, judges get in their cars and they blow up.
Yeah.
You know, so it's no joke, and they have to be very careful. And that prosecutor had a bodyguard following him around for quite some time.
Wow.
Just to make sure. Yeah.
So when did the penny drop for Massino that his brother-in-law had turned against him? When did he actually think? When did he find out? And was it a shock to him, or?
Look, I think it probably was. I mean, in the end, you know, it was obviously a great betrayal, and it was if you were ever to make the movie of this, you know, I think this would be a great sort of piece of dramatic tension, if you like, the sort of the relationship that Massino has with his brother-in-law, who is his underboss, who is his greatest confidant, friend, associate, you know, partner in crime, and his wife's brother, and how the rift of them, you know, slowly happens, how Sal gets sort of sidelined, becomes develops this grudge, and ultimately turns on Massino. And I think in the end that it would have been a great personal sort of affront to Massino, and I think that he would have felt very let down, obviously, and sort of betrayed by Sal. But I mean, in reality, these people are out to look after themselves and cut their deal and get out of prison as soon as they can. And so I don't think it's any great surprise, but the fact that they'd known each other their whole lives and were so close, it would have been a great betrayal. And, and given that, this is his wife's brother, it would have caused a terrible rift in the family. And what we found later on was, after Massino was finally put in jail, supposedly Josephini's wife, severed ties with him. Now that's probably just a bit of theatre so that she could cut her own deal with the feds and sort of get off a little bit lightly by handing over some of the booty, if you like. She had to do that. They actually had they had to pay restitution. In the end, I can't remember exactly what it was, but she actually went to the family vault, wherever it was, and produced all of this gold bars.
Wow.
That they'd been sort of storing their wealth in, and handed over millions of dollars worth of assets, cash, everything, to the government, which you often have to do. It's not just jail time; you actually have to pay up. And I guess in some ways the prosecution pays for itself. These are not cheap investigations. The investigation of Massino went on for more than 5 years. It involved dozens of agents. And so that happened. And I suspect that she sort of publicly said that she was severing ties with Massino so that she could hang on to some of the stuff. And I think in the end, she got the house, the big house in Maspeth, Queens. She got to hang on to that. The family home, and that would have been, today it'd be worth a lot of money. Several $1 million. And so yeah. In the end, there really is, the loyalty goes out the window, and of course, as we know, Massino in the end turned himself. So
that's a really interesting point. Massino, he was this old school gangster, followed the rules. He was like a perfect gangster, right? He didn't rat on anyone. He did jail time. He did everything that the mob expected of him. He followed the rules. He was a good underling to Rastelli and so forth. So he'd done nothing wrong in the mob. But then he's in prison. He's facing some serious jail time and a life sentence, right? He could be put to death if he's found guilty, right? So
that's right.
What was the turning point for him?
You're absolutely right. That is the exact reason that he eventually turned. Yes, he was, as Joe Pistone says, he was the last of the old world gangsters. He believed in a lot of these old traditions. As I say, though, I think that it was more about survival than it was out of any sort of like charming kind of oldie-weldy belief. But what happened was that Massino was charged with a string of racketeering crimes as well as murders. There was two cases, separate cases, that he was being prosecuted on. The first case was everything except for one murder. That murder was a separate case. It was the murder of Jolando Ciacia, who was known as George from Canada, who was one of these Canadian sort of connections to the Bonanno family. Ciacia was killed in 1999. By that stage, the law had changed and the death penalty had been reintroduced into the United States. And so the previous murders that had occurred, mostly in the 70s and the 80s, were not, he was not facing capital punishment on those crimes. He was facing life in prison. But in the final murder, the Ciacia murder, he actually was, the maximum sentence was death, where he would have been executed. And he would have been the first mob boss, I believe, executed in something like 50 years. And so it would have been a monumental thing to have happened. Mind you, this is New York, and they're not terribly keen on putting people to death there, although there are people on death row. And so he could have gone on to death row, no doubt about it. So you know, and the way that my book actually starts, and it was sort of a bit of a scoop that I got, was that in the moment that Massino was found guilty in all of those charges in the first case, and I was there and watched it, he actually turned to his wife like this. Josephine, who was sitting in the gallery, and he shrugged as they all went down. I mean, that was it for him. Was what we didn't know at the time was moments later, Massino says to someone in the courtroom, one of the officials, "I need to speak to the judge," which is very unusual. Usually you'd say to you'd instruct your lawyer, and they'd probably approach the prosecution. But for the actual defendant to go want to speak to the judge is a big deal. And the judge, who's a federal judge, is Judge Garifas, who was a lovely man. I met him, appointed by Bill Clinton. Federal judges are appointed by the president. Said okay, and Massino was ushered into the judge's chambers and confessed to the murder of Giolando Ciascia then and there. And the reason he did that was he knew that the chances of him now, if he'd not done that, he'd faced that case, given that he'd been found guilty on everything else, the chances of him not being found guilty on that last murder, 1 out of 7 or 8, I believe, was very slim. And he was going to go on a death row and could have been executed. And so, you know, he had nothing to lose at that point. And so that's when he turns witness for the prosecution. First mob boss in American history to ever do that. In my understanding, is none since. Of course, he was the last mob boss really on the street. And so he was the last to have the opportunity to do it, I guess. And I'll never forget the front page of the New York Post the next day. It said, you know, New York Post, obviously famous for its headlines, the great headline, you know, headless body and topless bar, their best known one. This one was mob canary on top perch. So, right, you know, Massino went out and sung. He sung, and that was it. And so he turns and becomes a witness for the FBI, and would have been deposed and would have pretty much just spilled everything. 40 years worth of secrets.
Let's just put this into perspective. This is like John Gotti turning state's evidence, right? This is right, as high as you can get. A man that has followed the rules, mafia guy through and through. I mean, this is unheard of. Amazing. I mean,
he's unheard of. And I'll never forget also him, the next time he came back into court, you know, there is, in any big court proceedings, there are a number of sort of procedural steps that you have to go through. And from time to time, the witness or whoever it is has to come back into court. And so this was the first time he'd been back in court, I think, since the verdict in his trial, where he was found guilty and everything. And of course, by now he's now cooperating with the government, and we all know that because it's become public. And so Mr. has to come back into court for some procedural motion, and he walks in. Of course, this is the only time we ever get to see him. Of course, he walks in, and he really was a broken man. You know, I mean, you could just see it. I mean, I remember him. You know, in the trial, he was always sort of this very robust, sort of, you know, tall, imposing figure, wearing a suit, never a tie, of course. You know, with his hair sort of carefully combed back, proud, tough guy. And the next time we see him after all this has gone down, he comes in and it's like a different person. I mean, he was sort of this forlorn, sort of diminished figure. He even looked sort of hunched over. He looked sort of like a broken person, and you could just see it in his face. He looked like he'd aged. And as he came in, he saw us all sitting there. You know, this is all the press who are covering it closely. And he kind of got this shock. And, you know, I think he was, you know, for him, it was sort of the ultimate in sort of humiliation, if you like. He'd gone from this, in his world, being this incredibly powerful person who'd spent a lifetime establishing, you know, who he was. And within a few weeks, he was just a rat. a nobody. And you could just see it, and it was written all over his face.
I mean, it turned into something that he absolutely hated. He became
Despised his whole life. He became it, yeah. And so, you know, it's I don't know. I think there's sort of a lesson in that. You know, I think it sort of speaks to the sort of the fantasy of this. All. I mean, it really, at the end of the day, it's all. I'm trying to think of a word that you can use on YouTube, but it's not really real. It's a bunch of guys playing tough. You know, it's real when they kill people. It's real when people get in the way. It's real. The money's real and all that. But these personas that they build is sort of it's almost a fabrication. It's built on a lie. It's built on a perception of fear, if you like. And once you're no longer feared, once you no longer have the money, you're just another schmuck.
yeah,
You know what I mean? You're just another inmate.
yeah,
And that's really what all he is now. And you know, and I think in a lot of ways that's justice served right there. I mean, when Massino had to stand up, that's what he had to do. He had to come into court and actually admit to that final murder. He had to. Oh gosh, I've forgotten the word that they use. There's a legal word that they use where you actually have to admit to your crime, and it's a very, very difficult thing for these people to do. And so, but they have to. It's part of the judicial process. Is you have to look the judge in the eye and say, "I did it." And he actually said, the words were, the prosecutor's there, and he said something to the words of, "I gave the order," and the judge looked at him and said, "For what?" And he said, "To kill George from Canada." That was the final murder, and you know, and that was the end. And in that blink of an eye, he goes from great mob boss, having books written about him, to just being a low-life killer. That's all he is.
wow. And you wanted an interview with him as well, right? You asked him for an interview, or you
Yeah,
reached out to his lawyer?
well, it's sort of a principle in journalism. You always give someone the right of reply.
Right.
Uh, it, and even when it's a mob boss, you have to give them the opportunity. We didn't, of course, think for one moment that he would actually accept it. Although, you know, I did interview his lawyer, David Breitbart, several times and got to know him quite well. Breitbart, of course, was a bit of a cowboy himself and wore a gun
Wow.
when he walked around the streets. And when I interviewed him, he actually had a holster on his hip attached to his belt when I interviewed him in his office. And when he'd go to the court, he'd have to take his gun out and put it in with the sheriff, the deputy sheriffs, because you can't take it in the courtroom, of course. And I actually wrote that in the Time magazine piece, how he was wearing the gun during our interview, or wearing the holster at least, and he didn't like that at all. He was very annoyed.
You probably just
Uh,
wanted to make sure that you were asking the right questions, right?
well, I think he was just a gun enthusiast. You know, he just was a guy who liked to wear a gun. I mean, I don't get it, but I guess people do.
Yeah.
But you know, it was a great, for me. It was a great little touch of color for my piece. He didn't like it though, because he sort of thought that it somehow portrayed him as being a bad guy himself. I mean, I don't think he really. Of course, he wasn't. He was just a lawyer. He was only in it for the money, like all these lawyers. But yeah. Anyway, but no, it was through Breitbart that I submitted a list of questions, written questions, and he did present them to Massino. So Massino was given the opportunity. I know that for a fact, and he chose not to take it. So, but you know, it was sort of ridiculous because, you know, what do you ask a mob boss? I mean, I literally, one of the questions had to be, "Are you the boss of the Bonanno family?" And apparently, well, what David Breitbart said back to me was that Massino had said, "Tell Mr. Crittle to have a nice day." So
Right.
that was as close as we got to each other. I mean, obviously, I saw him in court, and I also went to his restaurant in Queens once for dinner. This was after he'd been arrested, though. But that was as close as we got. So he said my name for whatever it's worth.
Wow. Interesting. And there was a little story about his nephew, I believe, when you were at an award ceremony in a hotel or something. I can't remember exactly.
Well, it was actually it was in New York City. It was at a hotel called I believe it was the Library Hotel, which was where I was holding my book launch. This was in about 2006. And so by this stage, I was actually working in Africa for the United Nations. So I came back to New York. A lot of people thought I went to Africa to get away from them. Of course,
Right.
I never felt
Journalist
any
protection
personal
program.
danger. You know, there's a few times when I was a little nervous. Yes, but anyway, so what happened was I was at the hotel and I was in the hotel room. It was right before the book launch. It was sort of ironic that this had happened. And Sal Vitale's son, whose name, sorry, escapes me. It's been a long time since I read my own book. But somehow tracked me down on the phone and called the hotel. And I literally pick up the phone and it's Sal Vitale's son, who is now in the witness protection program because Sal had turned witness.
Right. Yeah.
What happens is your whole family gets pulled in off the street, right?
Yeah.
Because they're all immediate danger. And so he'd called me from some army base somewhere or whatever, where he's being held, Nebraska or something. And says, you know, and for the first few minutes of the conversation, he identified himself. He said, "I'm so-and-so, you know, Sal's son." And for the first few moments, I was really at a loss for why on earth he was calling me. And I thought he was about to start threatening me, you know, start saying something like, you know, you this, you that for writing these things in this book about us and da-da-da. And I remember my oldest friend, who later became my best man, was in the room, and I was looking over him like pointing at the phone like this, not really knowing what on earth was going on. And then it became sort of clear to me that Sal's son was calling because he was trying to sort of endear himself to me, and he eventually said that he wanted me to write his memoirs. He wanted me to write another book about him, of which I never did. I never heard from him again. But it's about as close as I got. And it was funny because at the book launch, a friend of mine from the New York Post was there, and when I was reading from the book and so on, I told the story about how I'd just been called. And so then there was a little story the next day in the New York Post in the sort of the gossip column area, which was known as Page 6, quite a well-known column. And it actually, the little headline was "Call from the Mob," and it was a story about me getting this call. So yeah, so I had a few brushes, and that was one of them.
Brilliant, fantastic. Well, Simon, it's been great having you on. I'm sorry it's kind of I've taken up a lot of your time, but I just wanted to let the subscribers know that his book is absolutely fantastic. It is The Last Godfather by Simon Crittle. Please do check it out. It's at the link at the bottom of this video, so you can grab it on Amazon or whatever, right? But thank you very much for joining us, and I hope the viewers have really enjoyed the interview and what you've covered and so forth. There's a lot of detail and the book's fantastic. I might give it another read because it's been quite a while since I read it. So fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and all the best, and I hope you do write another mob book because there's definitely lots of appetite for mobsters and so forth. So,
and there's lots of stories out there. It's the genre that just keeps on giving.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and you take care now.
All right, son. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.